want to invite you to our third webinar, and I also invite you to go back and listen to the other two webinars, especially the first one, Don't Leave Money on the Table. Next Cycle Michigan has extended the deadline to August 11th for submission of micros grant applications. This is for small, innovative waste reduction and recycling programs. And there's a second round of applications due September 22nd. They make the award the following month, and this is one where you actually get cash money to do waste reduction and recycling projects that you may have had on your radar screen but haven't had the resources to take on. It's a really easy grant application with only 4 essay questions, each of which is 300 words or less, plus some boilerplate and some cost estimates. You can sign up for a free half-hour consultation with us, and we will help you fill out your grant application.
Yeah.
So Jessica has worked from 3,500 cow conventional dairy operations to organic farms that are smaller, where she was able to double the size of the herd from 100 something to 200 something. So we're going to talk about how SOPs can either cost you money or save you money. And how can they save you money, you might ask? Well, typically what we do for SOPs is you write the SOPs and then you put it in a notebook. And then you've got some documentation that you fill out every shift, and you put that in a different notebook. And then you have auditors coming in, and for each different kind of auditor, you do a whole nother set of documentation. So you may redocument the same processes 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 7 times. If you build good SOPs and build your processes on those, you can only do it once and save money. And then I'm an environmental engineer, 40 years experience. And as you'll hear when we get into the SOPs, I have literally taken SOPs, and by creating a template for them, was able to take 40,000 waste profile sheets and take those down to 400 categories. For safety data sheets, we went from 10,000 down to about 75 to 100. And in the process, we also knew what was the same and what was different across the SOPs, which made it fabulous for training purposes. So now we're going back to the Toyota house we showed you last webinar, but we're going to focus a little bit differently. The first thing I wanted to say is SOPs are not designed to make the worker obsolete. They're designed to make it easier for the worker to do their job well. So lean is not about efficiency at sacrificing people. It is to try to do the best possible job with the best safety and the highest morale of the people. The SOPs here, this is the classic Toyota production system house. And you see that the operations, stable and standard processes, that's where SOPs fall into. And training within industry was a program from the 1940s, World War II. And we had the job relations here, again, relates to that respect for the worker. It was very interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about training within industry in a minute. But up until that point in time, a lot of how well you were listened to was who you knew in the organization. And one of the things that training within industry actually standardized was that you wanted to listen to the person based objectively on the value of what they were saying, not on whether they were friends with the boss. They also talk about giving credit for good ideas, and actually specifically talk about respect for the worker. This picture on the right is actually a picture of a blueprint from back in the 40s that were the original training documents for training within industry.
So would you call that an SOP?
That's an SOP of how to treat your people well. Yes, and you'll see I think one of the last slides gives you some SOP of how to do an SOP and SOP of how to be a good supervisor. So yeah, we have some SOPs from back in the 40s. And so most people think that lean started with Japan, but lean actually started with Robert C. the Riveter back at the Willow Run Bomber Plant. And this was in World War II. up until that point in time, there had been a journeyman apprentice model for training. So the apprentice worked alongside a journeyman, and when they got good enough, they were turned loose on their own. Well, suddenly all the journeymen and apprentices are overseas fighting at the same time that we needed to ramp up war production. So Rosie was called in. And this training within industry program was hugely successful. It was the companies had to opt in. There was no charge to participate, but they did not have to participate. It was voluntary. And of the 600 participating companies, you'll see 86% increased production by at least 25%, 100% reduced training time by 25% or more, 88% reduced labor hours by more than 25%, and 55% reduced scrap by at least 25%.
I'm going to share the SOP that we, there it is.
So we created an SOP using a cute little tool that I created in a previous lifetime. So it was pretty ancient technology. And Jessica and I talked through the dairy farm operation that she had worked at, one of the farms she worked at. And so you'll see it's broken into sections. And if you look at it, you'll see that some of those sections are reusable. And we'll come back to this from time to time during the course of the presentation. Now this SOP, we would like to add pictures. We'd like to add links to videos. So this is the starting point, but this was last century's technology, like 2000s technology. So it needs to be brought up to date, but it does make it very easy to create an SOP and then copy that and only change what's different from one job to the next.
And I put it in the handouts so you can download it if you want it, so you can check it out later too.
So an example of this is that on this SOP, you'll see that in this particular SOP, we're using a brush to clean the cows before they're milked. To change this for a dairy that used manual cleaning, all you would need to do is take that section out and replace it by a section with a couple of different lines of text. All these little chunks of text are reusable. So let's go back and give you a little more idea of what are the best ways to do SOPs. So first you got to get into the mechanics, paper-based or technology-based. And the best answer is yes, it's both. Technology-based makes it easy to build them. If you have requirements for retaining paper in your audit documentations, you're then going to want to create paper, but you'd like the electrons to actually create the paper for you, not have to have a separate step. And then in terms of content, some of them are a written checklist. Some of them you add pictures to a written checklist, which makes it easier for some people to see, but they take up more space. And then ideally you give users a link to a video on their phone, a short video that you take on your farm so they recognize the operations. It's not a generic video. It's how we actually do things at our farm. And also you get better buy-in if the workers help put together these videos because they made them.
Yeah, that's fun.
So Jessica, what are the best SOPs you've seen at any of your dairy operations?
Usually we use the for milking, right? But I mean, there's SOPs for all areas. My favorite was for treating cows because, you know, it's very important for the employees to know how to treat the cows.
And you'll see if you pull up the that SOP again, you'll see that one of the sections is how we standardized on mastitis treatment.
I'll show it in a second. So this SOP, let's check it out. It says dairy milking parlor. We are using the brush, and the parlor is a parallel parlor. So, and it's a 60 double. So let's say that something broke, the cow pusher broke, so we need someone else that someone that is going to help push the cows to the parlor, and the mechanics will fix it in an hour. So every time something happens or something breaks, uh, you want to put it here.
And this is what makes these SOPs a living document instead of just put in a notebook and irrelevant. And then the next thing you'll see is the change. CSR means change since recent. I used to say change since last, but since different people work different shifts, you didn't quite know what that was. And you'll see that instead of just one underscore, that has 3 underscores, and so does the broken. So as a worker notices this and reviews it in their operations checklist, they're going to initial it. And once the supervisor sees that everybody who's done that job has initialed it, then they know that everyone has been made aware of that change. Because a big problem in dairies, really, and everywhere, is you've been gone for a couple of days and things changed while you were gone and nobody told you. And you get back and things are broken and you didn't know it, so you go try to use it, a bunch of aggravation.
Yeah, so this helps improve communication too.
Yeah. So this shows that change since recent. The next one was that we're using a new cleaning chemical. And in this case, the hazards are the same as the existing chemical. So if you were trained in the existing chemical, you already know what you need to do with the new one. And then if you want to see the safety data sheet, your supervisor can show it to you.
And the next one, it's the PPE, that it stands for personal protective equipment. So it's the equipment that you wear, right? Toed boots, safety glasses, gloves. Usually at the farm, we always wear those rubber boots and the long sleeves, and on top of that, the nitrile glove to milk.
And then we'll jump right to the section at the top of the second page, which is for mastitis. And so this talks you through somebody that level 1 mastitis will show some clumpings. It says what all 3 levels are. And then it says if the cow did not fully milk out, you'll need to hand milk her, and why. It tells you what the requirements are for the mastitis log at that particular plant. It talks you through how you paint the legs of that particular cow, if that's what you do at your facility. And then it tells you that it's okay to put the cow back because someone will come along and see her. But this lets this mastitis information be standardized from person to person. That make sense, Jessica?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, and so now we're going to go back to the presentation side of the thing and say that there are different levels of SOPs. And the one is for the first time you're on the job. And that's also the one that becomes the basis for your documentation that you put in your notebooks for auditing, because that's the most detailed one. And then if you're already familiar with the job, you skinny that one down to just the checklists. And there's a book out called Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande about the value of checklists and what they call high reliability organizations like emergency rooms and firefighters and aircraft carriers. And one of the things they found, the University of Michigan reduced the rate of infections by 85% by implementing a 7-item checklist for catheterization. So checklist, it's just a reminder, because I joke that I need a checklist for my coffee maker, because as you get tired, your ability to track what you're supposed to do goes down. And we're all tired working at cow farms, at dairy farms. We're all tired probably most of the time. That's a whole nother topic. But I have started my coffee maker without the coffee pot underneath it. That was probably the worst. I've turned it on with no water in it. I've turned it on with the spout turned the wrong way. So a simple little checklist next to it that says do this, then do this, then do this, then do this, it means you don't have to use any brain cells to do that. Yeah. And as someone who's working on some timers that then turns into old timers that I'm trying to fight off, I need to protect all the brain cells I can. And then if you've been away from the job, you just need a refresher. So you would know at that point in time, do you need to go back and look at the detailed SOP, or is the checklist good enough? But really here, what's most valuable is checking what's changed since the last time you were here and what's currently broken. And those changed since recent, those move to the bottom after they're turned off. And it will have the date that was no longer effective. So you'll be able to see, if I've been gone for 3 months, I can actually go back through the log of what's changed since the last time I did that job.
Yeah.
So reinforcing kind of the same concept. They're most useful if they're just at the right level. If they're too detailed when you're familiar with the job, they annoy you and you ignore them. And that's where that broken and changed since recent are useful, because if you just look at that, you know what's changed since you did the job most recently. But if they're not detailed enough and you're not familiar with the job, they're worse than useless. You think you've done something, the person is out there floundering. They may be afraid to ask for help, maybe afraid to ask questions and say, I don't know how to do this. What's your experience been with that, Jessica?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we go on vacation and then we go back and like we are using another antibiotic, or we tried to buy some antibiotic and wasn't in stock anymore, so we had to use another one. So we have to improve our or modify our SOPs. So SOPs will help you to improve that communication, and if you have them in English and in Spanish for or whatever language you need, will help improve a lot your communication with your employees.
And ideally, English on one side, Spanish on the other side. You can do that for the checklist, not so much for the detailed SOPs, because those are very seldom one page or less, much as we would love to get them down to one page. If they're one page, they're probably not useful to somebody who's unfamiliar with the job. So what should be on the detailed SOP, and you see this in the one that we just did, I actually like to have an SOP for the very first shift on the job that the person gets sent before they come in. And I can't tell you, I've done a lot of different COVID essential worker jobs over the last year, and none of them provided me with that. Some of them would provide me with one or two of the pieces of information, but things like, where do I park? What door do I get in? If I'm working night shift, how do I get in at night? What's the dress code? What are the standards around, can I use my phone, not use my phone? So having a separate SOP that you just make sure it covers all those details that you don't think about once you've been on the job the second time. You don't need it anymore. And then you see on the SOP the pre-job equipment, including the safety gear. If there's stuff that you need to go get to go out onto the job, I'll have a list of that. And then the high-level steps and detail, and what hazards to watch out for on this job. Rotating tools, for example, on PTO equipment on the tractors. One of the experiences I had was at an auto plant. We had a near amputation because we had lost the institutional memory that on rotating tools, rotating shafts, it's leather gloves or no gloves, but never cotton gloves, because those can catch. And so in that case, what we actually did, that was a fun exercise, because we had a paper SOP and we had the safety committee was there, and we had to read the paper SOP, and then we said, okay, turn it over. Where's the emergency stop for this job? Nobody had a clue. And then we asked them, what's the deal with gloves? And they all remembered that gloves were important, but half of them thought gloves were required, and none of them made that distinction about what kind of glove. Well, this was back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, and we had our programmer came in from Virginia with Adobe Premiere 5, back when it was single digits for Adobe. And I came down from Michigan with the software, and we put together a 3-minute video clip in which we talked about the hazards of rotating tool jobs and did a picture of the emergency stop. We showed that safety committee, that group, and asked them the same question. Of course, they all got it right. So today, with the video cameras in our cell phones, that's the powerful way to make training materials that stick.
Yeah, you can just do it right away.
And everyone likes to be part of that.
Yeah.
You have to get permission probably, because most dairies do have limitations on what you can video, but for putting it together for training. And then 2 other sections that are frequently missed on SOPs is what are commonly encountered problems and how do you fix them? And frequently asked questions, which are just that as questions come up, you just add it to the frequently asked questions section. Okay, on to, and what should be on the reminder SOP. This one actually gets copied into an instance of using this SOP. This becomes a checklist that goes in your operating log. And the 2 key things here is if there are exceptions, then you have a process for handling the exceptions. But the beauty of this is that this has been aligned with the processes that you're showing your auditor. When the auditor comes in, you say, here's the notebook that shows that we did what we said we were going to do. Because auditors, it's typically, tell us what you're going to do it, show us that you did it. That's what auditors want to see. So turning this into a checklist for each shift becomes the documentation of that we did what we said we were going to do. The SOP is what we said we were going to do. And then the exception tracking. I've had auditors who were unhappy when we said, well, nothing has ever gone wrong, because they know better. They don't believe you. So to have that exception tracking log gives you, and so then when your auditors come in, here's our SOP, that's what we said we were going to do. Here are the checklists, this is what we did. Here are the exceptions, this is how we managed exceptions. And they say, thank you very much, goodbye. That's a good thing to have happen with auditors.
Mm-hmm.
So how many auditors do the typical dairy farm getting these days?
Well, I guess it depends. Sometimes now there's one for animal welfare. If you're organic, then you will have your organic inspection. You have the federal, the state. So it's always good to be prepared.
And my experience was always that the toughest audits you would do were actually from the home office. That the corporate audits were way more detailed. They cared way more than the regulatory people. So then we go to training, and training also needs to be based on the SOPs. If you actually train from the SOPs, my best example for this is Zingerman's mail order. When you would be in training and you would have a question, they would say, what does the SOP say? Now, in their case, they had hundreds of SOPs, and you just go search for the SOP that related to that question. But if the SOP doesn't answer the question, you want to go change the SOP so that it does. We try to really avoid these works of creative fiction where the SOP bears no relation to what we do. And then we go, so how do we create an SOP? So the best way to do that, these are my silly little index cards. I was actually challenged for this by Tom of mail order because I was using sticky notes at the time. He said, index cards are cheap, you can throw them away, and sticky notes stick when they're not supposed to and don't stick when they're going to. So I took his fancy 3x5 SOP cards and took them to another level. I cut them in half. FedEx office will cut them in half for like $3 for 500 of them. I got the rings are $7.99 for 100 of them at Office Depot. And each step in the SOP is its own index card, is its own little index card. And you see here some notes from when Jessica was talking me through the milking process that turned into the SOP that you just saw. Then what you do is she, who is unconsciously competent at the job, hands it to me, who is consciously incompetent at the job. And I put it together. And how many questions did I bother you with, Jessica, while I was putting this together?
Like 100 phone calls.
at least 10 or 15 questions, probably closer to 20. It just seemed like 100. It wasn't actually 100.
It wasn't.
But then the next step is she's going to hand that off to somebody else who is unfamiliar with the process and say, does this make sense? So job instructions were how to actually teach from these SOPs. And it's very similar to the process that we use at Zingerman's, which is prepare, show, tell, do, review. So you get the materials ready, you've got a good SOP. And then you have the person who's being trained watch you do it at speed. And that's the key distinction here. Because otherwise, if you let them just start doing it, they're really slow and they don't know how fast it needs to be done to meet your production requirements. So having them watch how fast the milkers can hook up the milking machine, and getting a sense of how long that takes, then they have in their mind what their goal is and what they need to get to so that they can keep your dairy running on up to the production schedule it needs to be at. And so then you prepare, you show them, then you tell them, you walk them through the SOP, and then so then they do it over and over again until they get comfortable with it, and you review it each time they do it until they get it letter perfect. And I like this thing on the right, if the worker hasn't learned, the instructor hasn't taught, that it's the responsibility of the instructor and our training materials to get across the points we need to get across. And then since I'm a safety professional, I like to throw in safety somewhere in the presentation. And the topic for this month for me was emergency exits. My two stories about this is back when I was traveling and staying in inexpensive, which was sometimes quite charming, sometimes not so much, hotels. I was at this lovely little boutique old hotel in Pennsylvania, and I followed the emergency exit down from my room. And I got to the second floor, and there were a couple of doors, and it wasn't clear which was the emergency exit. And the one I chose to go out put me on the roof, one story up from the street, and locked out. And luckily, That was in the day when I actually did have a cell phone. It was the size of a brick, but I had one. And I was able to call the front desk and say, can you let me in? I'm locked out on the roof. Another example, and this is for your personal safety. Another example is in New Orleans. I was in the big fancy Marriott there, right in downtown next to the French Quarter. And I followed the emergency exit, and it was at least a half mile of winding corridors, and I wound up in the ballroom on the second floor. So if it had actually been an emergency, I wouldn't have been in trouble. At least it wasn't the basement where I would have been underwater in Katrina, but still not good. I like the picture in front of the restaurant table. So this gets you to the audits and SOPs. This kind of shows you what I was talking about, where there's a hierarchy of requirements that you have to meet at your dairy farm. And if before you build your SOPs or as you're building your SOPs, you think about those, you can reduce your workload because one set of SOPs and checklists will cover everything. So you start out with the regulations. Those include federal, state, country, locality. In California, every county has its own regulations, which is insane. Then you have corporate guidance documents, which are typically stricter than regulatory documents. And from those, you determine what your requirements are. And then to meet the requirements, you build those generic SOPs like the ones that we just showed you, like the one we showed you. You copy those off into job-specific SOPs. The example I give for that was we had a plant. I don't have a dairy example for this, so I apologize. Jessica, you'll come up with one. But we had isocyanate, which is it's a windshield sealer for us. So when we put the windshield in your car down in Saturn, you put this isocyanate sealant around, and then you put the glass windshield on. Well, while it's being used in assembly, it's a skin irritant, but it has no vapor pressure, so it's not an inhalation hazard. When that material gets to the repair hole, the isocyanate is cured. It has zero skin irritation potential at that point in time, but now you're grinding on it with a grinding wheel, so now it's an inhalation hazard. So at a dairy, the most likely place is going from where you're using bulk chemicals to
in the chemical room.
Yeah.
Usually the acid. Oh, I don't like to go to that room when the door is closed or there's no ventilation, because the acid will hurt you.
Oh no.
Yeah.
We'll revisit that. So then your job specific SOPs but the other thing that's good is that you typically don't have a lot of different examples of how things are used like that at a plant or a dairy. So those turn into the checklists that you saw, and then those turn into the audit documents that we talked about. And then maintenance is the key to SOPs working. So we already showed you what has changed since last. At a farm, things change frequently.
Yeah.
Summer, winter.
Seasonal, weekly, monthly.
Different set of cows ship, cows still here. And really, if your SOP building and tracking accommodates making those kinds of changes easily, it will be a living document, and it will support all your audit activities. And otherwise, it will be a pain. So if you look at because of that, if you look at your SOPs from a life cycle standpoint, creating the SOP is only about 10% of the work, and the ongoing maintenance is at least 90% of the work. And the most common SOPs are Word documents and Excel spreadsheets, where every change is really time consuming. You have no history of what the previous changes were. Every time somebody puts in a line of text, it's their own wording. It's not the same words as were used before. So they're easier. This is where you really want to pull out the technology tools to help you do this better.
Yeah, there's some software to create SOPs and make it easier for you.
Yeah, and you really want to. A lot of those, if they're geared to big manufacturing companies, a lot of it's geared around, we need to distribute this SOP to 2,000 people across 2,000 jobs. So they're not as concerned about how hard it is to create the SOP. You really want to talk to SOP vendors who have really streamlined how long it takes to create the SOP and how easy it is to change it. And that's some of the questions that we show in this choosing an SOP tracking process, but we're about out of time, so I'm going to keep rolling here. You can read these when you get the slides. This was the job method. So this is the SOP for an SOP, and this is the theory. This is how they teach you you're supposed to be to SOPs, and nobody does it this way. This is like, take every step in the job and ask, why do we do this step? Really, in the real world, you write up what you do, and because you've implemented continuous improvement in your shop, the workers keep coming to you and saying, we could do it this way and it would be better. We could do it this way and it would be better. And that's really how you build your continuous improvement.
Yeah, don't forget to ask the people that actually do the job.
And one last thing, because we're about done here, is this link will give you a link to the Training Within Industry case study, where you'll hear the story about how they came to that. It's a really fun read. And then if we move on to the Training Within Industry components, this is an actual blueprint of the training materials that they used to use back in the 40s. And the thing that's interesting about this one is that they studied where was training most effective. And because you've got all these levels of management, and then you've got the people actually doing the job. And they found that if supervisors are well trained, they can train the workers as the workers change and move around and change jobs and come and go. So they didn't have to try to manage each individual worker being trained. They could put that to the supervisor. And but the supervisor training it, you didn't need to get all of upper management involved, because they typically don't want to be involved in day-to-day operations. Then one other thing that we always do from a culture standpoint at Zingerman's, which is one of my part-time jobs, is we do announcements and appreciations. And if you add this to every meeting you ever do, you will be amazed at how it helps bring your culture together. So I appreciate all of Jessica's hard work in putting this together. My announcement is reach out to us for help filling out those micros grants. August 11th and September 22nd are the deadlines. And I appreciate all of you for attending.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks, Kathy.